Hello, everybody, and welcome to Ideas by Interpreters, episode number 13. Today we have Natalya Mytareva from CCHI, National Certification for Healthcare Interpreters, who's going to be talking to us today about the CHI performance exam. So welcome, Natalya, and I'll let you take it away.
Thank you, Caroline. Hi, everyone. I'm grateful and excited to talk to you today about the actual core and most interesting part of our certification program, which is the performance exam. Just briefly, if it's the first time you hear about us, CCHI is a national entity which offers certifications to medical interpreters, and its main principles are to offer a national, valid, credible, and vendor-neutral certification program. And when we started designing our programs in 2009, we are celebrating our 10th anniversary this year. We're very excited. We wanted from the very beginning to clearly define who our target audience is, because we can have exams that are geared towards master level interpreters for whom that is kind of the crown of their career. But in 2009, the healthcare interpreting field was at the state when certification was not required. It is still not required on a state, on many state or federal level, but more and more employers require certification. And because there's such a vast need for interpreters in healthcare, we very consciously made a decision that our certification will aim at entry-level healthcare interpreter. In other words, that would be the entry point in the profession. Like many other professions have, if you think of nursing, you start at a certain level of education, you could get you can become LPN. Then if you have more education and pass certification exams, you can become RN, etc. So our certification is entry level. But I want everyone to really think of what that entry level means for us. It means that it is still a person who can perform the functions of an interpreter competently, independently, and unsupervised in any setting and in any modality where healthcare is provided. In other words, an interpreter who is at entry level still has to interpret everything accurately, completely, without adding anything, with understanding of the cultural framework for interpretation. So it is not a person who doesn't know how to interpret yet, right? Entry-level interpreter is the person who may not have experience of working in many specialties, or they may not have experience in deep understanding of every part of healthcare protocols, but they do have this foundational ability to interpret everything accurately and correctly. And that is what we test through our performance exam. We offer two tiers of certification. The core certification, CoreCHI, is the exam that tests the interpreter's knowledge about healthcare interpreting. And because it's in English, it's available to interpreters of any language. But we understand that many people may know about interpreting and may learn about it, including code of ethics and medical terminology and all that stuff that is tested on that exam. However, the ultimate marker of whether they're able to perform the job is the actual interpreting, and that could be only tested when through a performance exam, which is language specific and addresses all the skills that interpreters need. The difficulty for the field, for the profession, and for us is that we cannot develop oral performance exams in every language. It is resources intensive, and it requires big pools of pilot takers, of people who develop the exam. So it is a very resources intense endeavor. For that reason, we have the most common common languages that are used in healthcare in the United States at this point, which is of course Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin. So our oral performance exam that I'm going to talk about today is language specific in Spanish, Arabic, and Mandarin. Um, where can you find the information further? I want just to state it up front is if you go to our website, cchicertification.org, we have a quick access button, get certified, or you can click on the menu and you get to the certifications link, which provides you all the information, including our main publication for any interpreter who wants to become certified. It's Candidates Examination Handbook. As you can see, we just updated it in January. We usually update it twice a year. So this is the latest. It has all the procedures, policies that apply to candidates and then certificates who earn certification. So the other question I want to get out of the way before we get into the substance of the exam is the fees. The initial fee is $210, which includes your application and the cost of the first exam, the core knowledge exam. And then the actual cost of the oral performance exam is $275. So if you're an interpreter of Mandarin, Arabic, and Spanish, that fee you pay after you pay the CoreCHI exam. And also, according to our policies, you have 1 year to take this oral exam after you pass the CoreCHI knowledge exam. All fees are non-refundable, and this fee is for one administration of the exam because that is the fee goes to our testing vendor for the testing location, for secure storage of the exam content, and to the raters who are going to score your exam. They are employees who are paid for scoring your exam. So I'll talk about scoring a lot today. So let's talk about the exam itself. It is computer-based, and it's also delivered via internet. And because of that, obviously, there is always a challenge of finding the locations for the exams because we need to have a reliable internet connection. And as everybody else, we are at the mercy of large companies like Microsoft, Google, others who update their software, and that may affect our exam at any point. So it is a challenging situation, but because it is administered in physical test centers, our candidates have to come to the test center. It makes it a little easier because candidates don't have to worry about that. Our proctors take care of that. The exam is dual language and it has 7 oral performance responses and 1 multiple choice question. Everyone has 1 hour, 60 minutes to complete. Because the exam requires rating by human raters, we want to make the process as objective as possible. And we score it in the pool of X number of exams per language. And for that reason, we deliver that exam only 4 times a year. And our schedule for each year is available at our webpage, which is called scheduling. We call these periods that when you can take exam testing windows. Each testing window is approximately 3 weeks, and right now we are in the last week of our winter testing window. We end testing on February 12th. The exam takes place in a private room because it is an oral performance exam. In other words, candidates have to speak and record their answers. We require private room so that the candidate can concentrate better, but also so that nobody can actually hear what the candidate is saying, because that would compromise the security of the content. And unlike our CoreCHI exam, where you can see the scores right there at the test site, with the oral exam, you have to wait until scoring is done for everybody, because again, our quality assurance process is multi-step, and we need to have all exams scored before we apply our quality control, and then we can release this course. So we usually release this course 6 to 8 weeks after the last date of testing. So for example, this testing window was January 22nd through February 12th. Our scores will be available around March 28th, which is about 6 weeks after February 12th. These are the limitations of human beings, as always, right? Computers are wonderful. Anyway, what do we test on that exam? The three foundational skills that interpreters of any setting have: interpreting in the consecutive mode, in the simultaneous mode, and sight translation. And this is, as you can see, the bulk of our exam: 75% consecutive, 14% simultaneous, and 9% sight translation. We also have that one multiple choice question which tests indirectly your translation skills. The reason for including that, we obviously understand the difference between interpreters and translators, is the content and the construction of the exam is built on the National Job Task Analysis Study, where we ask every 6-7 years, we ask people to complete a questionnaire, where we ask them to say what do they do on the job. And based on that analysis, based on other considerations of the current practice, these percentages are assigned. And when we did our job task analysis last in 2016, we got the confirmation that majority of the work of interpreter in healthcare is done in consecutive mode. However, there is tendency to have more and more simultaneous mode involved in the job. There are some hospitals which actually do quite a lot of simultaneous interpreting. And then the sight translation is on that interesting position in our field that some hospitals very categorically say the interpreter must sight translate, and almost the same equal amount of hospitals say the interpreter should not or must not sight translate the documents. So because the field is still split, in order for us to say that a certified interpreter is able to work in any environment, we have to test that skill, because otherwise, if this person changes jobs and goes to a hospital which requires sight translation, they won't be able to do that. And the national survey also stated that still interpreters are asked to translate some parts of documents on the spot as part of their interpreting duties. We all as professionals understand that this is not really the core part of our job, and we educate the providers, encouraging them to actually hire translators to do that. But because the field still has it, we have to test it again to make sure that our certificates could perform the required tasks in any setting and in any modality. Obviously, if you're a video interpreter or a telephonic interpreter, you'll never be asked to translate anything, right? Because they'll simply, not be able for you to write down the translation. But if you're a staff interpreter, face-to-face interpreter, then you may be asked to translate things like, if your temperature goes higher than 103 degrees, please go to emergency room. So it's usually very short excerpts. And for that reason, the way we test that skill is not by actually asking the candidate to translate, but by asking them to choose the best translations through a multiple choice question. So the exam components, because the most part of the exam is consecutive interpreting skill, we have 4 consecutive vignettes, which are bidirectional English to and from the second language, and they're just normal dialogues, a conversation between a provider and a patient, or a provider and the patient's family member. Then we have 2 simultaneous vignettes. They're unidirectional, one from English, one into English. We have sight translation, which consists of 3 brief passages from documents that are used in healthcare settings. And then, as I already mentioned, the written translation is tested through a multiple choice question. So let's talk about consecutive. That's the most frequently used skill in the healthcare setting and the foundational skill for pretty much any interpreter in any setting. In our vignettes, in our 4 dialogues, we have different lengths of dialogues, but the longest one is 24 utterances. And utterance is not a sentence, utterance is a turn of the speaker. It could be a couple of sentences, and but we have the rule that each utterance is no longer than 35 words, and we have a balance between shorter and longer utterances. On our exam, you can play each utterance a maximum of 2 times. Obviously, you cannot pause the utterance. You just have to replay it again, and you are allowed to take notes during the whole exam. So the challenge, of course, here is because it would be too easy, right? If you could play in every single utterance twice. But remember, I said the exam is only 60 minutes. So that's the natural barrier to interpreters who are not ready yet to be certified, because a certified interpreter wouldn't need to play every utterance twice. So we require our candidates to monitor their own time, and if they don't spend it wisely, they may run out of time, and as a result fail the exam because they simply did not interpret at the pace that is professional. And that pace has been tested by several groups of volunteers who are practicing interpreters to determine how many seconds per utterance we need to leave for recording and how long each dialogue or each section could be, so that ultimately an interpreter at the certified level of their skills has reasonable time to demonstrate successful performance. For example, just to give you a practical example, if the first utterance on many dialects is "Good morning, my name is such and such, we're going to talk about XYZ," right? This is a very easy utterance. You don't need to replay it. Or "Thank you, doctor, I will do that." Again, nobody needs to replace it. But there are some utterances which are more complicated, and especially if this is a specialty, medical specialty that you're not very experienced in interpreting, and then that would be the one where you would be paying maybe more attention to the wording in the utterance. And after you play that utterance, then you hit the record button and you record your interpretation. So this is what the screenshot for the consecutive part of the exam looks like. So here you have the timer, which will tell you how many minutes are left. Then these are the directions, pretty much the same on every screen, that when you're ready, you click play, and what you also see that there's an announcement that is consecutive interpreting here, that this is vignette 1 of 4, and this vignette specifically has only 14 utterances. And then you click play, and right now it shows that, because I took a screenshot of it, I already played it once, so there's 1 time left, and then you click record. When you click record, what happens, it's important, is that you see that there is this recording bar moving, and the word recording is appearing. So that means that the microphone is working correctly. And when you're done, you click stop, because you can leave reasonable amount of seconds for each candidate to record their utterance, and many of them don't need that many seconds. So the more seconds you save, the more time you have for the next part of the exam. The simultaneous vignettes have maybe up to 2 minutes long, but they're somewhere in not exactly 2 minutes. The reason for them to be so short is because in healthcare, when you think about when simultaneous mode is used, it's clear that it's very different than simultaneous interpreting in court or business conference, right? Because in conference, for example, if you're an interpreter for United Nations, you'll be interpreting simultaneously all the time, switching with your partner every 20 minutes or so. Same thing in court. If you're interpreting for a trial, That's when you'll be using your simultaneous skill mode. So again, it'll be extensive periods of time. In healthcare, we use simultaneous mode when a patient is emotionally distraught, either crying or angry, and usually the while we're interpreting simultaneous, the provider has an opportunity to de-escalate situation, to provide either comfort or some kind of resolution. So really, you don't interpret like somebody yelling at the provider for 2 minutes, right? It's usually shorter. The provider will get it and they'll try to do something. Another type of simultaneous interpreting is for a psychotic patient who are disfluent and who doesn't make any sense, right? In this case, clinician also doesn't need you to interpret for 15 minutes, something that makes no sense. Usually clinicians stop after about 60, 90 seconds. And so that's why the length of the simultaneous interpreting we determined for our healthcare field up to 2 minutes would be enough to have on the exam. So on that section of the exam, we have only one button, play and record. And you need to make sure that you start interpreting within 10 seconds because you're not allowed to replay it, to pause it. You have to just continue and interpret. One of the recommendations I can give any candidate who takes any kind of simultaneous, you need to really make sure you practice beforehand on being focused and on hearing the meaning, analytically listening for the meaning and monitoring yourself, making sure that you truly are producing complete sentences or sentences that are as close to complete as you hear. Because the major mistakes in simultaneous is the fact that the person sticks to each word so closely that they forget that it should be a grammatically complete and grammatically correct sentence, and instead it becomes just a stream of words put together. So that's the beginner's mistake. So the more you practice, the more you record yourself and then listen to yourself how you do it, the more you can make your simultaneous skills better. This is what the screenshot looks like for the simultaneous part. Again, it's announced here. Here in the blue, and you saw the same thing in the previous screenshot scenario. This is a 1 to 2 sentence description of what you will encounter. In other words, what kind of appointment it is, how many people's voices you will hear, and what kind of medical specialty it is. And as you clearly see, here is just one button. You click it, and it tells you here that this particular vignette is only less than 70 seconds because the time for you to record is 70 seconds. We always add time at the end to allow the candidate to finish the interpreting. Now the site translation items. The site translation items consist of 3 short excerpts in English that represent different kinds of healthcare documents that are appropriate for site translation. In other words, we don't ask you to site translate documents that will never be site translated, like, for example, living will, right, or any other legal types of documents that are used in healthcare settings, but they're not site translated. So one excerpt usually is something about patient education, like pre-op instructions, post-op instructions, or information about their condition or treatment. One excerpt will be some type of educational document, like health history form. And one excerpt is represent those legal or quasi-legal documents that patients are usually required to sign. And by short, I really mean short. Each segment is has a word limit, so it's no more than and I've got blank. I'm sorry. I think it's no. Each segment I think is no more than 50 words, but they're really short passages. I know they're no more than 3 sentences. So the way the screen looks the same here is your site translation announcement. In other words, that's kind of delineating the section of the test. And after the words except 1 of 2, 3, or 3 of 3, like here, you'll have the actual text in English. All site translation goes from English into the patient language. And then there is one button. So the good part about site translation is if you saved yourself time on the first 2 sections, consecutive simultaneous, then you can read this text as long as you want. You can, and I really advise you to do so, that before you click that record button, you actually know what you're saying. If there are some unknown terms to you in that segment, then you need to think of how you're going to say them. Because obviously you have to produce something. The worst thing would be to omit it or keep it in English, because in this case you really need to show that you're able to handle even the words that you don't really know at this point, but you need to show how you will try to translate them, site translate them into English, into the patient's language. And then you click the record button and you record your answer. So how do we score the exam? In other words, this section that I'll go over hopefully will help you understand how to prepare for it as well. So first of all, we have several teams of raters for each language, and raters do not know your candidate's identities when scoring the exam. They also never know if the candidate passes or fails the exam. So this is done intentionally to eliminate any potential bias against a specific individual. Also, each oral response is scored independently by 2 raters. As I said, there are 7 oral responses in 1 exam, so 7 by 2 is 14. Potentially 14 people can touch your exam, and the more people touch it, the more objective the process is. Because if one person, let's take Spanish, if one rater, let's say, is from Argentina, another one from Mexico, and the candidate is also from Mexico, then yeah, they're lucky they got the Mexican rater, but that is balanced by the other rater, right? And vice versa. If the candidate is, in this case, let's say from Honduras, is not helped by anybody. So the fact that we try to have as many raters score the exam is very important to us, because that allows us to be to have the scores for each candidate as objective as possible. Raters do not see each other ratings. They're not allowed to discuss and say, well, I'm giving this point. How many points are you going to give them? So no, then that is not allowed, because each rater and raters as a group are trained quarterly. We retrain them every time we add any new content through multiple hours to make sure they all know how to apply our score system and do it consistently. We also monitor our raters through the psychometric statistical reports, where we see how close they agree with each other, and also compare the raters of different languages, how their agreement goes between languages. And so far, we have had all great parameters on human rating. If 2 raters disagree by 1 point, then the 3rd rater scores the response, and a formula is applied to give the candidate the score that is most beneficial to the candidate. All scores are then weighted according to our proprietary formula, which is derived from our technical report and the job task analysis. And then we scale it to the distribution of 300 to 600 points. In other words, the lowest score you can get is 300 points, and the highest score is 600 points. The passing score is 450. And here is the most important part of what distinguishes a professional certification exam from, let's say, an exam when you graduate from a course or a college, etc. It doesn't matter what your score is. The most important part, you get certified if you pass, and you don't get certified if you fail. Um, Obviously, every single testing window, we have candidates who pass at 450 and we have candidates who fail at 449. To me, I'm always very empathetic to candidates who get 449 because what it shows is that they're very close to passing, but their skills may not be very stable yet. And I hope to believe, I mean, I believe that most likely those candidates who get 449 simply were affected by the anxiety of taking an exam because we're all adults. I know how terrifying it is, especially since many employers nowadays require you to take the exam. And if you don't get certified, then you may lose your job. So I understand the pressure. So it is truly important that you practice and study before the exam, no matter how good an interpreter you are, because this testing situation does affect us as adults much more than it affects us when we are younger, and when we are still in the training kind of college school routine. When it comes to professional assessments, stakes are higher, and as a result, anxiety is higher too. Um, so a little bit more about the scoring process. So as you heard, the raters independently score. How do they do it? Each rater listens to a recording, through again online tools, and they apply 4 different scales independently. In other words, again, it's not exactly how it happens, but roughly speaking, so rater listens to your recording once and first applies the scale of, let's say, lexical content. In other words, they're listening how accurately you interpreted the unit's information that were present in the source. And the unit of information can be one word, right? It could be a group of words, or it could be a concept. And on these scales, I cannot tell you how many points you get for what, but I can tell you that the most common errors that we see are omissions, additions, and inaccurate translation. In other words, there's nothing new about this, right? And I'll give you a little bit more examples about the errors in a minute. But I want you to really, when you are preparing, to focus on understanding what is important, what are the units information in any utterance, in any text. For example, if I'll tell you a simple sentence, you need to take these pills with water during the meal, all the words are very simple, right? But if you are omitting the words with water, we know that it's not because you don't know how to say water or with. It's just something in your brain didn't compute, and you didn't realize that with water is a very important unit of information, and the impact is very severe on the patient, right? The medication could cause some serious side effects if it's not taken properly. So for medical interpreters, that's always a big factor of what makes us accurate and successful medical interpreters, because we have this unit information that consists of simple everyday words, yet they are more important. So in other words, if a candidate omits that with water, they will get a much lower score than a candidate who will omit thank you very much 10 times, right? Because on the dialect, there could be, oh, thank you, or sir, could you please? You omit all these politeness things, yeah, you will get some points taken away, but maybe even not. It depends. But if you omit that with water, You made a crucial mistake that affects the patient's life and the treatment and all the liability by the provider. So, and that's how you would be penalized for. So it's not always about the terms, although surprisingly, even the terms on our exams are often mistranslated by failing candidates. And by the terms, remember I said it's entry level, I literally mean entry level. Our terms on the exam are about the most common conditions, and the terms would be literally like heart, lungs, blood vessels, arteries, I don't know, just the most common basic terms, ER room, your next appointment, things like that. So we don't have their terms like avoiding cystourethrogram. No, nothing like that. It is all the terms on the exam in all sections are very entry level because that's what the exam is geared towards. Now, the next scale is, it's not next in terms of sequence. Raters could choose what they apply first. It's up to them. But another scale is register of speech. The current consensus in the profession, and again, it's not something CCHI invented, it is derived from the field, from the publications by the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare, by all the training providers that are currently teaching healthcare interpreters. So the current consensus is that an interpreter needs to maintain the register of the speaker. And what that means is that if the doctor speaks at a higher register using formal words, that's how we should interpret. If the patient speaks using formal words, that's how we should interpret. If the patient speaks a very low, uneducated register of the speech, that's how we should interpret. So, in other words, the interpreters should stick to the register of the speaker because that's what makes the interpretation accurate. Accuracy is not only the words, but the intent, the emotional charge of those words, the formality of the words. So for that reason, we have this scale, and raters also apply it to your response. And here again is the closer you are to the original, to what you heard on the exam, the higher your score will be. Another scale is obviously grammar because you need to demonstrate that you are able to produce grammatically correct sentences and that the grammar of your produced answer matches the intent of the speaker. So we often see errors where there is a change, where there are changes in verb tense agreement, the use of incorrect pronouns, inaccurate word order in the target language. And as many of you on the call, I myself am an interpreter. My native language is Russian. Obviously, I speak decent English, but I know that towards the end of the day, some things, your brain gets tired and you start reverting to. And I notice I speak with more Russian grammar towards the end of the day, or when I'm very tired than when I'm, very focused on what I'm speaking. So it is natural, but the point of the exam to ascertain, are you able to demonstrate that you can keep your grammar correctly? And surprisingly to me, the most mistakes in grammar are in the English side of it. For Spanish candidates for whom Spanish is not a native language, that's when they, of course, their main mistakes are in Spanish grammar. But for the other languages, it seems that the majority of our candidates are native speakers of non-English language, and as a result, most grammatical mistakes are in English, not in Arabic or Mandarin. And then the last scale raters apply is quality of speech. In other words, the physical characteristics of the delivery of the response by the candidate. We take points away if you have false starts, hesitations, if you have numerous repeats, like, oh no, that's not what I mean, and like hesitations like very rarely it's really mispronunciation of a word because so far most candidates definitely know English, of course, and then other language, and so very rarely we have that poor pronunciation of a word where the raters cannot figure out what did they say. Did they say this or that? No, usually it is these hesitations that sometimes candidates run out of time. Of recording their answer is because they're not very confident and fluent in the pace of their interpretation, and as a result it hinders understanding. And in our case the raters are assessing that, but in real life it would be that the patient, by the time they hear the end of your sentence, they may forget what the beginning was, right? So that's why it is an important skill of a certified interpreter to speak or to interpret at a pace that is easy to follow for the listener, and that's what that scale is designed to measure. After the scores are ready, again 6 to 8 weeks after the exam, candidates are sent a score report, and here's just a mock-up report. All these numbers are made up for a failing score. As you can see, you'll get the report saying for 50 our passing score, you scaled for 45, and this is what you will see. These sub-scores are meant for really to just give you guidance to show you how good you did in each subset. So the first subdomain is interpreting consecutively. It means the 77% means that the highest score for consecutive is 100. Out of that 100, you got 77%. So interpreting simultaneously, again, out of 100 within that score, you got only 79%. And then for written documents, in other words, either sight translation from written documents or that written translation question, we bundle them together because there's such a low percentage on the exam. So here the candidate got 72% out of the total possible 100% for these two written types of input. So again, I want to reiterate, you don't add up these three numbers because that they obviously will be way above the score, because this score report has nothing to do with this number. This score report is to show you potentially which skill is the weakest. But I want to caution is, first of all, you may just have had a bad day in the beginning or was too anxious, and so then you started concentrating more. So it's really, if you fail, you need to prepare and practice all skills. But the closer you get to passing score, and that's why I picked this example for 50, so it's only 5 points away here, these numbers become less and less hard to interpret, so to say, because they don't look too bad. If you had like 23%, obviously that's clear, like, oh, you don't know how to do a sight translation. So looking by these numbers, I can see that probably if the person will work a little bit on their sight translation skills, they may get enough points to pass the exam. But I'm still thinking, look at this, the simultaneous is actually higher than consecutive, and that's one of the things that I noticed with our candidates. Many of interpreters think that the simultaneous interpreting is their weakest skill, and as a result they'll be the hardest part of the exam. It may be your weakest skill, but it's still not too bad. And on the exam, because it's such a low percent of the whole thing, you actually are not doing that bad. But what we notice is most interpreters who fail because of consecutive. And then the second hardest part is sight translation. And simultaneous is actually not as hard as people think. They may be more nervous about it, but the data shows that really consecutive is where you need to focus your attention on. And if you did very well there, then the rest will take care of itself. Now, let me spend a couple of minutes talking about the errors that we noticed in the candidates who fail our exam. So we analyzed the errors of failing candidates. And as I mentioned earlier, not all interpreting errors are equal. There are errors that do not change the meaning and the intent of the message. They're still wrong. They're still errors, but they do not change the meaning. Like, look at this statue, right? There's something wrong here, but you can get still that this is the face. of a person, although it is upside down. So, um, and then there are errors that change the meaning to a point, or the end, the intent of the message, that they may cause potential harm. And so naturally, most candidates who fail tend to have these kind of errors. Uh, and of course, some of these, but that's what makes you fail. If you, as a bilingual speaking person, did not hone that skill of interpreting things really accurately, then you're not ready for our exam. So let me give you examples of what I mean. So one of the most common errors is the easiest to avoid, in my opinion, is the error of omission. So here is an example of a non-critical error in this case. So here is what the candidate may hear on the exam. The street, it's not the actual exam, by the way, because obviously I cannot share with you the content of the exam, but here what we can hear: the street was dark, and suddenly I felt I was hit on the head. I could not see well. And the candidate says, it was dark, then someone hit me on the head. I could not see well. Yeah, here the candidate admitted, suddenly I felt. It's omitted, right? There's just no argument. It's not substituted here somehow. It's just left out. And that means it's inaccurate. But in the grand scheme of things, so to say, the message was not distorted. It's lacking some precision of the statement of the patient, but theoretically, all the information that is critical to the patient care has been conveyed. Now let's look at a different sentence. He loves, oh, I'm sorry, this got deleted here. Spicy foods got moved here. He loves rice and spicy foods. When will he be able to eat that type of stuff? He loves rice and when will he be able to eat that type of food? In other words, I apologize, this is something happened during the saving process, but the idea here is that the candidate missed the spicy foods from their interpreting. And as a result, if you think of the medical implications, the doctor heard, instead of does he loves spicy foods and rice, the doctor heard from the interpreter, he loves rice. When can he eat it? Rice is a pretty neutral type of food. So after a surgery, probably most patients could start eat it very quickly, right? 24 hours, 48 hours, I don't know, depends on the surgery, of course. But spicy foods, again, depending on the surgery, may not be allowed for a longer period of time. So that kind of omission would be very critical for the candidate, and it will be penalized harder on our exam. Another example of an error is wrong word choices. Same sentence here. The street was dark, and suddenly I felt I was hit on the head. I could not see well. And the candidate says, the corner was dark, then someone hit me on the head. I couldn't see much. Instead of the word street, they said corner, and instead of could not see well, could not see much. So these are wrong word choices, and they're not hard words, and these are actually like the approximation of the errors is very typical to what we really hear, that for some reason candidates will just make these kind of changes, and I doubt they don't know how to say the word street. It was something that made them just not focus enough and substitute it, especially that you can play this twice and you can make notes. But anyway, that's what we see happens with candidates. So they obviously, if they continue it, and naturally if the person does it once, most likely they'll continue doing it. So that would contribute to the number of mistakes on the exam. But here is a worse example of this mistranslation that is very close to what we actually hear from failing candidates. Instead of suddenly I felt I was hit on the head, this candidate says, suddenly someone punched me in the face. Right? That is a big mistake, and it's has different type of situation, etc. Because hit on the head is not quite clear whether the hit was from the front of the person's head, but most likely, right, especially like the street was dark and suddenly I felt, most likely this person was hit on the back of the head. They didn't see the assaulter. So Well, someone suddenly punched me in the face. That means somebody approached you and punched you in the face. If we even think a little bit harder, because in the real situation you don't know, what the repercussions could be. Let's say this is an appointment for a person who has some post-traumatic stress disorder after an assault. The person who was hit on the head, their behavior will be that they will be always looking over their shoulder, right, to see that nobody is approaching them to hit them on the head again. The person who was punched in the face, they will be trying to not look people in their faces. They'll start to just not to come close to any person up front because they will be afraid that somebody will punch them in the face. So, and if this is mistranslated at this level, that has potential consequences for the treatment and understanding by the provider of what actually happened to the patient. So that's why our role is that important, to keep the units of meaning very accurate. And unfortunately, failing candidates are the ones who make these type of mistakes. Um, Another example, additions. That was puzzling to me when I was doing this analysis, is that, well, no, you should not add anything as an interpreter, yet even on the exam, and I can maybe somewhat understand in the heat of the moment when you're interpreting, you inadvertently may start clarifying and adding stuff to make it clearer while you shouldn't really. I can understand that, but this is what I observed in the failing candidates' responses. Here's an example of non-critical additions. Instead of that sentence, this utterance, the street was dark and suddenly I felt I was hit on the head. I could not see well. The candidate interprets, it was dark, so I didn't see anyone. All of a sudden, I was hit on the head. I couldn't see who or why. So this is kind of completely like making up the story, making it interesting. Almost to me sounds like the candidate in their head decided like, well, that just doesn't sound like a very juicy story. Let's make it more interesting. Don't do that because this is, even though this is non-critical, but overall, these kind of additions will get you in trouble on the certification exam. But more so if your additions will actually cause a mistranslation. And here is the candidate, an example of that. It was dark in the street. Suddenly someone hit me on the head. I lost vision and I passed out. Yeah, all the person says, I could not see well. Maybe they didn't lose vision. Maybe it was dark and that's why they couldn't see well. Maybe that sentence refers, in other words, the interpreter doesn't have enough context to really understand what that means, could not see well. So they should keep it as vague as the English original is and not add things like I passed out, because that shows that, pretty much to me, it shows that the interpreter knows better than the patient what to say, right? So the interpreter starts speaking for the patient, starts creating things that never came out of the patient's mouth, and that's not what we do. That's the difference between a bilingual speaker, a friend who can just make up stories, and a professional interpreter. So the fact that I give you this example is that we do see candidates who add things on the exam that have not been there, and these things that are added are very, very critical. And the last example about register. So far, I haven't seen, I mean, obviously I did not look at every exam. I only looked at small samples of 50 exams from each language, but I have not come across the register errors that were critical. So here are examples of non-critical errors. Instead of, is it going to hurt a lot? There was a candidate who pretty much every sentence interpreted like this. Is it gonna like hurt a lot? Is it gonna like, seriously? I mean, like teenager speaking, and the voice was not a teenager voice. So pay attention. If it is said, is it going to hurt? Don't make it gonna like. And then another example where the register was elevated compared to the speaker. The speaker said, no, I didn't notice any smell. And the candidate interpret, no, I didn't notice any smell with discharge. Probably in that conversation before there was the word discharge used, or maybe the candidate said, like, in this situation, the patient should have said. But what again it demonstrates is that the interpreter, instead of interpreting literally what they hear, decided to come up with their own story. And that's what we're not allowed to do. So I wish I could share with you some errors which are like, oh, if you, that would make a big revelation, but I don't. All the errors we found usually stem either from the fact that the person doesn't know two languages very well, or they think that they could make this kind of decisions and add or omit things that they think are illogical or for some reason don't fit the situation very well. And that just demonstrates that they're not ready to be interpreters. So obviously why it happens is failure to monitor output. If that is part of our professional duties, we don't teach it as much and we don't pay attention to it as much. But ultimately, think of it. If you just a bilingual speaker, you speak like you speak your native tongue, right? You just, whatever comes out of your mouth at that moment, your only sensor is deep in your brain. But what you say, it doesn't matter. But as interpreters, we have to listen to what we're saying and always check, okay, I thought I was saying she is, and instead it came out he was. Oops, I need to correct myself. So that's what we are required to do as an interpreter. That's what differentiates us from the bilingual speaker. And you see how I monitored myself here? Differentiates was a wrong choice of word for me when I just a second ago said the word differs. But the professional interpreter would always listen to what they're saying. The other reason for these errors is misunderstanding of the source language, and that's what I mean, that some candidates simply don't possess enough knowledge of either English or the other language to identify units of information correctly. Poor memory skills and not taking notes. One of our exams has, not exams, one of our vignettes has some numbers there. This is the opportunity, because we give you a piece of paper and pencil, write down those numbers. But I've had candidates transpose numbers, make fewer numbers than were said, and make up numbers. I'm not kidding. Adding numbers and making them up, like, that is the easiest part. You just write it down. So it's important that if you don't have the memory, or you know that you don't have the memory to remember certain things, or when you come to numbers, just write them down on the job and write them down on the test before you interpret them. Insufficient proficiency. So the grammar mistakes that I was speaking about, those are the common ones. That's usually when people interpret into English. And lack of knowledge of medical terminology and body parts. It's almost always obvious that the person has never interpreted for that specific specialty. So when you're preparing for the oral exam, think of a clinic and a hospital and hit every single specialty, in other words, every single department that you think about, and look up at the basic terminology. You don't need to dig too deep. You just need to have a basic understanding of what it is that they do in imaging, what kind of tests, right? EGD, chest x-ray, x-rays of bones, MRI. That's it. Then move on to the next department, labor and delivery. What do they do there? So don't come to the exam unprepared, even if you don't have the experience in interpreting in a specific patient. So pretty much I gave over the tips already, as I said, what the barriers are to successful interpreting and what causes the error. So learn to monitor your output. Practice text analysis so you know the units of meaning. Practice memory skills. As I mentioned, our utterance is up to 35 words. Challenge yourself in the practice to remember 45 words. Then on the exam, when you're nervous, you'll definitely remember 35. Like with the athletes, right? They always try to jump high on practice so that when they come to competition, they have no problem jumping the heights that they are supposed to. Improve your proficiency in English and the other language by constant reading, listening, and watching materials in both languages, and study terminology. The easiest way is to think of the usage of the parallel text. And we do have some resources on our website. If you go to the education section, we have this link to the portal, and the online portal is at our other website called CCHIinterpreters.org, where we offer free practice exam, just to give you an idea what the computer exam is like, and also to give you an idea of the type of language you will hear. It doesn't really give you any diagnostic how good you are. We don't give you the score. It is just for you to get a general idea, and feel free to do it. It's free, and um, we hope that anyone before taking the real exam will take that sample or practice exam. With that, oh, Carolyn, I think I talked too long. Do we have any questions?
No worries, Natalia. It was very, very informative. Thank you so much for going through that so exhaustively. It was really, really important information. So in terms of questions, we only have one that I think you already covered this. If the testing site for each exam, I assume, is listed on your website as it becomes available. Is that correct?
That's right. If you go into our certifications section, there will be the page for scheduling, and there are links to the test sites.
Mm-hmm.
When the new ones are added, they appear there. It's a search. You search by the city and the state.
Okay, sounds good. Well, it's 12 o'clock now, so we're finishing just on time. Thank you so much again for being here with us, Natalia. And everybody else, thanks for joining. And we will see you in about 2 weeks.
Okay, great, great. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.